The Masked Protector. Chapter 1: The Discovery. Ethan Thompson had always been curious about the stories of his hometown, a small settlement near the edge of a vast forest in Montana. Legends spoke of hidden caves and ancient artifacts left behind by indigenous tribes. As a kid, he often dreamed of finding one of these treasures, but as he grew older, the demands of school and life pushed those dreams to the back of his mind. Until now. It was summer and Ethan had just graduated high school. College awaited him in New York City, but before leaving, he decided to take one last adventure in the woods. Armed with a flashlight, a backpack, and a map he'd drawn from an old tale told by his grandfather, Ethan set out early one morning. The sun was high overhead when he reached a rocky hillside deep in the forest. According to the map, a cave entrance was nearby, hidden by overgrown bushes. He combed the area, pushing aside branches and ferns, until he found it, a small opening barely large enough to crawl through. Heart pounding with excitement, Ethan slipped inside. The cave was cool and damp, its walls lined with moss and strange carvings. He shone his flashlight around, revealing intricate symbols and depictions of animals. At the far end of the cavern, a faint glimmer caught his eye. Ethan approached cautiously. A wooden chest, half buried in the dirt, sat in the center of the chamber. The carvings on its surface were unlike anything he'd seen, geometric patterns intertwined with images of eagles, bears, and wolves. His hands trembled as he pried it open. Inside were several items: a stone amulet, a small leather pouch, and a pair of worn leather socks. The socks were unusual. Though old, they felt soft and supple, as if they had been preserved perfectly. They were intricately stitched with symbols similar to the ones on the chest. Something about them seemed alive. Curiosity got the better of him. Ethan slid the socks onto his feet. At first, nothing happened. He wiggled his toes, laughing at himself for expecting some kind of magical transformation. But then, a sudden warmth spread from his feet up through his body, and the cave seemed to shimmer around him. "What the?" Ethan whispered, stumbling backward. He felt lighter, as though gravity had loosened its hold on him. Testing his balance, he jumped, only to find himself hitting the ceiling of the cave, nearly 10 feet above the ground. Panicked and exhilarated, Ethan landed softly, his knees bending as though his body knew how to absorb the impact. "No way," he muttered. He tried again, this time leaping forward. He soared across the cavern, landing gracefully near the entrance. Ethan's heart raced. What was happening? He glanced at the socks, now glowing faintly. He tested another theory, focusing on his surroundings and willing himself to disappear. To his shock, his hands began to vanish before his eyes, followed by the rest of his body. "This is insane," Ethan said, his voice echoing in the empty cave. He willed himself visible again, and his form reappeared, solid and real. The possibilities flooded his mind: super strength, invisibility, incredible agility. These socks were more than just artifacts, they were something extraordinary. As the initial thrill wore off, Ethan sat by the chest, carefully examining the other items. The amulet seemed to hum faintly in his hand, and the pouch contained a handful of stones engraved with similar symbols. Were these items connected? He couldn't be sure, but one thing was clear: the socks had been crafted with a purpose. Ethan thought back to the stories his grandfather had told him. According to legend, the indigenous tribes in this area had created sacred objects to protect their people. These objects were infused with the spirits of nature, granting the wearer abilities beyond human limits. But such artifacts were always tied to great responsibility. Responsibility, Ethan murmured. The word felt heavy. For years, he'd been content with his ordinary life, dreaming of bigger things but never truly acting on them. Now, fate had thrust him into something far beyond his understanding. As the sun began to set, Ethan made his way back through the forest, the socks hidden under his boots. He couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change forever. The quiet of the woods seemed to hum with anticipation, as though the world itself knew he was on the brink of something extraordinary. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events in his mind. The abilities the socks granted him were incredible, but they also raised questions. Why had they been hidden? Who had made them? And for what purpose? And most importantly, what was he supposed to do with them? Unable to stay still, he pulled the socks from his bag and slipped them on. A surge of energy coursed through him, and he felt alive in a way he never had before. Testing their power, he leapt from his bedroom window into the backyard, landing silently on the grass. The world around him seemed sharper, clearer, as though he were seeing it for the first time. Ethan spent hours experimenting. He practiced leaping over fences, climbing trees with ease, and using invisibility to sneak past the neighborhood dogs without waking them. By dawn, he was exhausted but exhilarated. The socks were more than just a gift, they were a calling. As he prepared for his upcoming move to New York, Ethan couldn't help but wonder how these powers would fit into his new life. The city was a world away from his quiet hometown, a place of endless possibilities and challenges. But one thing was certain, wherever he went, the socks, and the responsibility they carried, would go with him. Standing in front of his bedroom mirror, Ethan looked at his reflection, the socks glowing faintly on his feet. "I don't know why you chose me," he said softly, "but I won't waste this chance." With that, Ethan began packing his bags, ready to leave behind the boy he had been and step into the unknown future ahead. Please like the video and subscribe the channel. Chapter 2: A New Beginning. Ethan Thompson stared out of the bus window as the New York City skyline came into view. Skyscrapers gleamed in the sunlight, their steel and glass facades stretching into the clouds. The city pulsed with life, a stark contrast to the quiet forests of Montana he had left behind. For an 18-year-old boy with a pair of magical socks in his backpack, it was both exhilarating and overwhelming. He stepped off the bus and into the chaos of Manhattan. Cars honked, people rushed by, and the scent of street food mingled with the metallic tang of the city air. Ethan tightened his grip on his duffel bag and headed toward the subway. His college dorm awaited, a new chapter of his life about to begin. Adjusting to city life was harder than Ethan had anticipated. The sheer number of people, the unrelenting noise, and the fast pace left him exhausted by the end of each day. His classes at NYU were intense, filled with bright students who seemed to have everything figured out. Ethan felt like a small fish in an enormous ocean. But the nights were different. When the city settled into a relative calm, Ethan would slip on the socks and explore. The powers they granted him made navigating the urban jungle feel like second nature. He leapt across rooftops, scaling fire escapes with ease and landing silently in alleyways. The sprawling metropolis, which had seemed so intimidating by day, became his playground by night. Ethan's abilities allowed him to see the city from a unique perspective. From the top of a skyscraper, he could watch the lights twinkle like stars below. He felt free, unbound by the rules of gravity or the constraints of ordinary life. But even as he enjoyed the thrill of his newfound powers, a nagging question lingered in his mind: what was he meant to do with them? One evening Ethan found himself wandering through a quieter part of the city. The streets were dimly lit, the storefronts closed for the night. As he turned a corner, he heard a commotion, a woman screaming, followed by the sound of running footsteps. Instinct took over. Ethan darted toward the source of the noise, his heart pounding. In a narrow alley he saw a man snatching a purse from an older woman. The thief shoved her to the ground and bolted. Ethan's grip tightened around the straps of his backpack. He had the power to intervene, but doubt crept in. What if he got hurt? What if someone recognized him? Then he remembered the mask. Rummaging through his bag, Ethan pulled out a simple black ski mask he'd packed for winter. He slipped it over his face, hiding his features. With a deep breath, he put on the socks. A surge of energy coursed through him as the socks activated. His muscles felt coiled and ready, his senses sharper. Without hesitation, he launched himself into action. The thief turned a corner, confident he had escaped, but Ethan was faster. Leaping from a nearby dumpster, he vaulted onto a fire escape, climbing effortlessly to the rooftop. From there, he tracked the thief's movements, jumping between buildings to keep pace. When the thief slowed to catch his breath, Ethan seized the opportunity. He leapt down from the roof, landing silently behind the man. "Drop the purse," Ethan said, his voice low and steady. The thief whirled around, startled. "Who the hell are you?" Ethan didn't answer. Instead, he focused, activating the sock's invisibility. His body shimmered and vanished. "What?" The thief staggered backward, his eyes wide with fear. He dropped the purse, his hands trembling. "I'm out of here," he shouted, sprinting away into the night. Ethan reappeared, picking up the purse and exhaling deeply. His hand shook, adrenaline still coursing through him. This was the first time he had used his powers against someone, and the weight of the moment wasn't lost on him. He returned the purse to the woman, who was sitting on the sidewalk, shaken but unharmed. She looked up as he approached, her eyes widening at the sight of the masked figure. "Your purse," Ethan said, setting it down gently. "Thank you," she whispered. "Who are you?" Ethan hesitated. "Just someone trying to help." Before she could say more, He disappeared into the shadows, his heart pounding as he made his way back to his dorm. Back in his room, Ethan peeled off his socks and stared at them. The events of the night played over and over in his mind. He had stopped a crime, helped someone in need, and done it all without anyone knowing who he was. It felt good, right, even, but it also raised more questions. What if the thief had been armed? What if Ethan had been caught? The stakes were high, and the realization of just how dangerous this could be hit him hard. But another thought lingered. He had made a difference. In a city as big and chaotic as New York, where so many people fell through the cracks, he had stepped in when no one else did. The next day, Ethan tried to focus on his classes, but his mind kept drifting back to the previous night. He felt like he was on the verge of something bigger, a purpose he had yet to fully understand. That evening, he took out a notebook and began sketching ideas for a disguise. The ski mask had worked in a pinch, but he needed something more practical and intimidating. A hooded jacket, gloves, and dark clothing would help him blend into the shadows while protecting his identity. Ethan also started researching crime in the city, reading news articles and watching local reports. He learned about the neighborhoods most affected by violence and the patterns of criminal activity. If he was going to do this, he needed to be smart about it. The socks gave him incredible abilities, but they didn't make him invincible. He would need to rely on strategy as much as strength. By the end of the week, Ethan had a plan. He would use his powers to fight crime, but he would be careful, choosing his battles wisely and always staying one step ahead. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time since arriving in New York, he felt a sense of purpose. As he stood on the rooftop of his dorm that night, the city stretched out before him, its lights flickering like a living organism. Ethan tightened the mask over his face, the leather socks glowing faintly on his feet. "I don't know where this will lead," he said to himself, "but I'm ready to find out." With that, he leapt into the night, the guardian in the shadows beginning his journey. Please like the video and subscribe the channel. Chapter 3, The Masked Protector. The night air in New York City carried a certain edge. The bustling metropolis was alive with energy, even after the sun went down. But beneath the city's bright lights, shadows loomed large, hiding dangers that most people preferred not to think about. For Ethan Thompson, these shadows had become his domain. By day, Ethan was an unassuming freshman at NYU, juggling lectures, assignments, and the occasional late-night study session. By night, he became something else entirely. Dressed in his carefully crafted outfit, a black hooded jacket, gloves, a sleek mask that covered the lower half of his face, and his enchanted leather socks, he prowled the city, seeking out those who preyed on the vulnerable. It had been weeks since Ethan's first encounter with crime, and his reputation was already beginning to grow. Local news outlets had started reporting on a mysterious figure who seemed to appear out of nowhere, thwarting crimes and vanishing before anyone could catch him. "Masked Guardian strikes again," one headline read. Another called him the Phantom Vigilante. Ethan had to admit the nicknames amused him. But more than that, they fueled his determination. Crime patrols in the city were on high alert, and police scanners buzzed with chatter about the masked figure. Ethan kept his ear to the ground, using apps and forums to track incidents in real time. He knew he was walking a fine line. The police wouldn't appreciate his interference, and the criminals he targeted were getting smarter and more ruthless. One night, Ethan found himself perched on the edge of a rooftop overlooking a convenience store. Inside, a robbery was unfolding. Two masked men held the cashier at gunpoint while a third raided the register. Ethan clenched his fists, the leather socks glowing faintly beneath his boots. He activated the invisibility power and descended silently, scaling the building with ease. Entering through a second-story window, he crept down the stairs and into the store. The robbers were too focused on their task to notice him. Ethan positioned himself strategically and deactivated his invisibility. "Hey," he said, his voice low and commanding. The robbers spun around, startled. The sight of a masked figure dressed in black, his eyes glowing with the reflection of neon lights, was enough to unnerve even the bravest of them. "Who the hell are you?" one of them demanded, raising his gun. Ethan didn't respond. Instead, he leapt forward with inhuman speed, disarming the man in a single fluid motion. The gun clattered to the ground as Ethan swept the man's legs out from under him. The other two robbers hesitated, exchanging nervous glances. Ethan used the moment to his advantage. Activating the sock's super strength, he flipped the counter, creating a barrier between himself and the remaining criminals. The men scrambled, but Ethan was faster. He leapt over the counter, landing with precision behind them. In a matter of seconds, robbers were disarmed and subdued, their weapons tossed far out of reach. The cashier stared in disbelief as Ethan tied up the criminals using cords he found behind the counter. You saved me," she stammered. Ethan nodded but didn't stay to chat. As soon as he heard sirens in the distance, he activated his invisibility and slipped away into the night. Back at his dorm, Ethan felt the familiar rush of adrenaline mixed with exhaustion. His double life was taking its toll. Balancing schoolwork with nightly patrols was no easy feat, and his grades were beginning to suffer. But every time he thought about giving up, he remembered the faces of the people he had helped, the relief, the gratitude, the hope. He began refining his tactics, studying martial arts videos online and researching strategies for urban combat. His powers gave him an edge, but skill and preparation were just as important. He also worked on improving his disguise, adding reinforced padding to his jacket and customizing his mask to include a voice modulator. Ethan's nights were no longer random patrols, they were calculated missions. He mapped out the city's high-crime areas and focused his efforts where he could make the most impact. From petty thieves to gang members, he faced them all, learning with each encounter. Despite his efforts to remain anonymous, Ethan couldn't avoid drawing attention. Rumors swirled in the criminal underworld about a masked protector who moved like a ghost and struck with the force of a hurricane. Some called him a myth, while others viewed him as a threat to be eliminated. One night, while monitoring a police scanner, Ethan overheard chatter about a gang planning a large-scale operation. The details were vague, but it was enough to put him on alert. He spent the next few nights gathering information, tracking the gang's movements and piecing together their plan. They were targeting a jewelry store in Midtown, intending to use explosives to bypass the security system. Ethan prepared meticulously, studying the store's layout and mapping out potential escape routes. When the night of the heist arrived, he was ready. The gang moved swiftly, disabling the alarms and breaking into the store under the cover of darkness. Ethan watched from a nearby rooftop, waiting for the right moment to strike. When the first explosion went off, shattering the reinforced glass, Ethan activated his powers. He leapt from the rooftop, landing silently behind the getaway van. The gang members were too preoccupied to notice him as he climbed onto the roof of the vehicle. As they loaded the stolen goods, Ethan made his move. He dropped into their midst, delivering a series of precise, powerful blows that left the gang reeling. One of the men pulled a knife, slashing wildly, but Ethan dodged effortlessly. With a single punch, he sent the man sprawling. Another gang member tried to flee, but Ethan's long jump ability allowed him to intercept, cutting off the escape. Within minutes, the gang was incapacitated, tied up, and left for the police to find. Ethan disappeared into the shadows just as the first patrol cars arrived, his heart pounding with a mix of triumph and relief. As he returned to his dorm that night, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The city was vast, and its problems were too many for one person to solve. But he wasn't deterred. He had chosen this path, and he was determined to see it through. The masked protector was no longer just a myth, he was a symbol, a reminder that even in the darkest corners of the city, there was someone willing to stand up for what was right. And as long as he had the socks, Ethan knew he could keep fighting. Please like the video and subscribe the channel. Chapter 4: Rising Challenges. Ethan Thompson's double life had grown more complex than he ever imagined. By day, he juggled classes, assignments, and the occasional study group. By night he was the masked protector, leaping across rooftops, battling criminals, and slipping away before anyone could identify him. His reputation had spread far beyond the local news. He was now a topic of discussion in New York's criminal underworld. What Ethan didn't realize was that his growing presence was beginning to disrupt more than petty thefts and street crimes. His actions had caught the attention of a powerful crime syndicate operating in the shadows of the city. The first sign of trouble came during one of Ethan's routine patrols. He had intercepted a shipment of stolen electronics being moved through a warehouse on the city's outskirts. The operation was larger and more organized than anything he had encountered before. Ethan managed to disable the guards and alert the police to the location of the goods. But as he slipped away into the night, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. The criminals had been better equipped, more disciplined, and less frightened of him than the usual street-level thugs. Days later, Ethan received confirmation of his suspicions. A news report detailed the arrest of several men connected to a syndicate called the Crimson Tide, a notorious organization involved in arms trafficking, smuggling, and extortion. The warehouse bust had been a major blow to their operations, and their leaders weren't happy. Ethan's activities had put him on their radar. Balancing his personal life with his nighttime missions became increasingly difficult. Ethan's professors began to notice his distracted demeanor, and his grades started to slip. His roommate Tyler remarked on the dark circles under his eyes and the mysterious bruises he often tried to hide. "Man, are you okay?" Tyler asked one morning, glancing at Ethan over his cereal bowl. "Yeah, just been pulling a lot of late nights studying," Ethan replied, avoiding eye contact. Tyler raised an eyebrow. "Studying? Or sneaking out to meet someone special?" Ethan forced a laugh, brushing off the question. But deep down, he knew he couldn't keep up the charade forever. The crimson tide struck back one night when Ethan was patrolling a neighborhood in Queens. He had been tracking a group of men suspected of running a protection racket. As he approached their meeting spot, a warehouse near the docks, he realized too late that he had walked into a trap. The moment he stepped inside, floodlights illuminated the space, blinding him. A voice boomed over a speaker. Well, the masked protector in the flesh," the voice said, dripping with mockery. Ethan's instincts kicked in. He activated the invisibility power, but as he moved to escape, a net shot out from above, tangling around his body and pulling him to the ground. Men emerged from the shadows, armed and wearing matching insignias, a crimson wave embroidered on their jackets. "We've been watching you, hero," said a tall, muscular man who appeared to be their leader. "You've been a thorn in our side for too long. Time to teach you a lesson." Ethan struggled against the net, his mind racing. The socks gave him strength, but he couldn't activate their full potential while restrained. Thinking quickly, he feigned exhaustion, letting the men believe he was more vulnerable than he actually was. As they closed in, Ethan suddenly tensed his muscles, tearing through the net with a burst of strength. The men recoiled in shock, giving him the opening he needed. Ethan leapt into the air, landing on a stack of crates. Using his agility, he darted around the warehouse, taking down the men one by one. His invisibility allowed him to confuse and disorient them, and his strength made short work of their weapons. The leader proved more challenging. Armed with a steel baton, he moved with the precision of a trained fighter. Their battle was intense, with Ethan narrowly avoiding several crushing blows. But in the end, the socks gave him the edge. With a powerful kick, Ethan sent the man sprawling. Sirens wailed in the distance as the police closed in, alerted by a silent alarm Ethan had triggered during the fight. He disappeared into the night just as the authorities arrived, his heart pounding. The encounter rattled Ethan. The Crimson Tide was unlike anything he had faced before, organized, dangerous, and relentless. He realized that his actions had escalated the stakes, drawing him into a world far darker than he had anticipated. For the first time, he questioned whether he was in over his head. Over the next few weeks, Ethan worked tirelessly to learn more about the Crimson Tide. He hacked into public records, scoured online forums, and eavesdropped on criminal conversations during his patrols. What he uncovered was chilling. The syndicate had ties to corrupt officials, international smuggling rings, and a network of operatives spread across the city. Ethan knew he couldn't take them down alone, but asking for help was out of the question. The police didn't trust vigilantes, and he couldn't risk exposing his identity. He began using his powers more strategically, focusing on dismantling the syndicate's operations piece by piece. He targeted their supply lines, disrupted their communications, and left evidence for the authorities to follow. The Crimson Tide responded with increased aggression. Ethan narrowly escaped several ambushes, and his injuries became harder to hide. He pushed through the pain, driven by a growing sense of responsibility. One night, after narrowly escaping another trap, Ethan found himself on the rooftop of his dorm, staring out at the city. The weight of his dual life pressed heavily on his shoulders. "Why me?" he muttered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Why was I given these powers?" The answer didn't come immediately, but as he watched the city lights flicker, a sense of clarity began to form. The socks weren't just a gift, they were a responsibility. Ethan had been chosen to wield their power, not for personal gain, but to make a difference. He tightened the mask over his face, a renewed determination in his eyes. "If the Crimson Tide wants a fight," he said softly, "I'll give them one. But on my terms." With that, he leapt into the night, ready to face the challenges ahead. Please like the video and subscribe the channel. Chapter 5: Shadows and Light. Ethan stood on the rooftop of a skyscraper, staring out at the glittering expanse of New York City. The wind whipped around him, tugging at his hood and mask. Below, the city hummed with life, unaware of the storm brewing in its shadows. He had spent weeks dismantling the Crimson Tide's operations, striking their warehouses, sabotaging their shipments, and delivering their lower-level operatives to the police. Yet the syndicate's leader, Victor Crane, remained elusive. Crane was a man of immense power, both in the criminal underworld and beyond. He had connections to politicians, law enforcement, and an army of enforcers ready to do his bidding. Tonight, it would all come to a head. Ethan had tracked Crane to a heavily guarded penthouse in Midtown, the heart of his empire. The plan was simple: confront Crane, bring his empire crashing down, and end the syndicate's reign of terror. Ethan activated the invisibility power of his magical socks and scaled the building silently, leaping from ledge to ledge with inhuman agility. The penthouse was a fortress surrounded by armed guards and state-of-the-art surveillance. But Ethan had planned carefully. He disabled the cameras and motion detectors one by one, his movements precise and calculated. As he approached the main entrance, 2 guards stood in his way, their weapons glinting under the moonlight. Ethan dropped silently behind them, delivering swift, incapacitating blows. The guards crumpled to the ground without a sound. Ethan slipped inside the penthouse, his senses on high alert. The air was thick with tension, the opulence of the space at odds with the darkness it concealed. Gold fixtures, marble floors, and priceless art adorned the rooms, a testament to Crane's wealth and power. Ethan found Crane in a large office at the center of the penthouse. The man sat behind a massive desk, flanked by 2 heavily armed enforcers. He was older than Ethan had expected, with sharp features, silver hair, and eyes that seemed to pierce through the shadows. "So," Crane said, his voice calm but laced with menace. "The infamous masked protector. I've been waiting for you." Ethan stepped forward, his mask concealing the grim determination on his face. "Your reign ends tonight, Crane," he said, his voice altered by the modulator. Crane laughed, a low, chilling sound. "You think you can stop me? You're just a kid with a few tricks. This city belongs to me." With a nod, Crane signaled his enforcers. They lunged at Ethan, weapons drawn. The fight was brutal. Ethan activated his super strength, deflecting blows and disarming the men with calculated precision. He moved like a shadow, his agility and invisibility giving him an edge. But the enforcers were well trained, their attacks coordinated and relentless. Ethan narrowly avoided a knife thrust, countering with a powerful kick that sent one man crashing into a wall. The other fired a stun baton, but Ethan dodged, leaping onto a bookshelf and propelling himself across the room. As the second enforcer fell, Crane stood, revealing a concealed weapon, a compact but deadly-looking handgun. "You're impressive," Crane admitted, leveling the weapon at Ethan. "But not invincible." Ethan activated his invisibility just as Crane fired, the bullet missing him by inches. He reappeared behind Crane, disarming him with a swift motion and sending the gun skidding across the floor. "You've ruined enough lives, Crane," Ethan said, his voice firm. "It's over." Crane smirked, his demeanor eerily calm. "You really think taking me down will change anything? Someone else will take my place. The Crimson Tide is bigger than me, or you." Ethan hesitated. Crane's words struck a nerve. Could one person really make a difference against such overwhelming darkness? Before Ethan could respond, the room shook violently. An explosion rocked the building, throwing him off balance. Smoke and debris filled the air as alarms blared. Crane used the chaos to his advantage, grabbing a hidden blade and lunging at Ethan. The 2 grappled amidst the destruction, their movements frantic and desperate. Ethan's strength gave him the upper hand, but Crane fought with the ferocity of a cornered animal. As the building continued to tremble, Ethan knew he had to win the fight quickly. With a final, powerful strike, he sent Crane crashing into the desk, rendering him unconscious. Ethan looked around the crumbling penthouse, realizing the explosion wasn't an accident. Crane had activated a failsafe, intending to take Ethan down with him. Activating his agility, Ethan grabbed Crane and leapt out of a shattered window, using the sock's power to soften the landing as they tumbled onto a nearby rooftop. The building behind them collapsed in a cloud of smoke and fire. Ethan tied Crane up and left him for the police, his heart pounding as sirens filled the air. The next morning, the city woke to headlines about the Crimson Tide's downfall. Victor Crane had been arrested, and evidence of his syndicate's crimes had been exposed. The media credited the mysterious masked protector, though no one knew his identity. Ethan watched the news from his dorm, a mix of exhaustion and pride washing over him. He had done what many thought impossible, but he knew the fight wasn't over. That night, Ethan returned to the rooftop where it had all begun. The city stretched out before him, its lights twinkling like stars. He thought about the lives he had saved, the criminals he had stopped, and the sacrifices he had made. The socks glowed faintly beneath his boots, a reminder of the power and responsibility he carried. He pulled his hood over his head and adjusted his mask. "The city still needs me," he whispered to himself. "And I won't stop." With a leap, he disappeared into the night, a silent guardian in the shadows, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Please like the video and subscribe the channel.